Chapter 1. Biff, bang, bing went the snowballs against the side of my apartment at 5 a.m. We were having an unprecedented snowstorm in the foothills of Tulumna County, California. I was a young girl of 23 years old, a tenderfoot or greenhorn, right out from Iowa. It was 1898, my first winter in California. I was operating a dressmaking shop in the little mining camp of Stent near Sonora. When the storm blew up, the boys at the camp had promised me a good old-fashioned face washing to remind me of home. They were true to their word, for here they were already throwing snowballs and threatening to break in if I didn't come out and play snowballs with them. There were two girls living next door to me in a little home boarding house, a type of which there are always so many in any mining camp. They promised to help me out in the fight. When they heard the fun begin, they came out. It was we three girls against a pack of rowdy boys. There were 2 inches of new, wet snow, which soon became mixed with the red clay. What fun we had! We played and hollered till the snow melted and we all got wet, muddy, and tired. The camp boasted a few dug wells, our only water supply, one of which was next door to me in front of the boarding house. After our snow battle, I crossed over to the well for a bucket of water to clean myself in my apartment, which had been tracked with red clay inside and out. While I was drawing the water, a man came from the boarding house rubbing his eyes. Heartily looking at me, he said, "Why in the hell didn't you get down in the backyard or some back alley if you're going to yell around here like a pack of Paiutes?" As I was the only human in sight, his remarks were addressed to me. Thus were the first words spoken to me by the man who was to become my husband a few short months later. I had seen him going to and from the boarding house for months, and I knew his name was Mr. Olds, but until now we had never spoken. I knew who he was, for he and I had helped substantially in supporting a lady and 2 children a few months before. Our charitable work came about in this way. Mr. Olds had a friend, a big Scotchman by the name of Herb McNeil, who was jovial when sober, but quarrelsome when drunk. One night, Herb got on a drinking spree, had a fight, and was shot twice through the hip. Mr. Olds hired a livery conveyance, and with the help of another man got Herb to the hospital in Sonora, 8 miles away. Next morning, when he got home, he went down to see how Mrs. McNeil and the 2 children were going to live while Herb was out of work. He found them with no means of support. He'd given her $10 with the promises more when that was gone. This is where I came into the picture. A little boy came to the shop one day, stood looking at me, straight at me for a moment, and then exclaimed, "Miss Thompson, you have beautiful teeth." I smiled and said, "Thank you, little fella, thank you. Whose little boy are you, and what's your name?" "I'm Bobby McNeil. My daddy's in the hospital. I have a little cocker spaniel puppy with a long tail. Daddy said we'd have to find somebody with good teeth to bite the puppy's tail off." "You have such good teeth. Won't you please come home with me and bite my puppy's tail?" The little boy looked so earnest that I didn't dare laugh at him. I knew he was the son of the man who had been shot. "I would like to come home with you and see your puppy, but I won't promise to bite off his tail." I was curious as to what had prompted such a queer request, and also anxious to see how Mrs. McNeil was getting along without a payday. For I knew miners well enough to know that one payday barely reached the next. Mrs. McNeil told me that her husband thought it was much better to bite a puppy's tail off than to cut it off, and had jokingly remarked, "Miss Thompson, the dressmaker, has such beautiful teeth, we should ask her to come down and do it." After Herb went to the hospital, Bobby became the man of the family and took it upon himself to see the puppy's tail was properly taken care of. I found the family in need of help, so I told Mrs. McNeil that I was a dressmaker and batching and didn't have much time to cook. And I suggested that I would furnish the food for all of us for the evening meal if she would cook it. It would be a favor to me if I could come down and eat with them. In that way, Mr. Olds and I kept the McNeil family for almost 2 months until Herb was able to go back to work. Side note, often back in the day, people believed that there might be a worm that was in the tail of a puppy, and that you had to cut the tail to remove that worm. It's probably the spinal cord that they were thinking of, but that's just one of those old wives' tales that thankfully we've done away with, and a lot of dogs are not, tails are not docked at all anymore. Although I'd never met Mr. Old, I'd often heard Mrs. McNeil tell what a wonderful man he was. The time of our first encounter, he was trying to work nights at the mine and sleep in the daytime, and we in our hilarious fun had disturbed his rest. "Oh, Mr. Olds," I said, "I'm very sorry we disturbed you." "Too late to be sorry now," he snapped. "There's no apologies accepted." He turned abruptly and went back in the house, leaving me thinking he was the darndest old crank I'd ever met. I told everyone what I thought of him, wanting them to share in my opinion. Perhaps I was a little egotistical and stuck on myself, for I was used to hearing compliments rather than a tirade like this. The world in general had gone wrong with Mr. Olds that morning, and after his rude awakening he went down to the mine office, drew his time, and left town. I didn't see him again for some time. I felt so bitter about him, I really hoped he would never return. Not so with the boarding-house girls. They said he was awful good pay, and they hated to lose him. In the meantime, I was very much interested in a dashing young Irishman named Murphy, who was foreman of one of the mines. He had a wonderful baritone voice, and I realized now it was the voice and not the man that I thought I was in love with. We were keeping steady company, as we called it in the gay 90s. Mr. Murphy was very methodical in his courting. He called on me every Wednesday and Sunday evening, promptly at 7 p.m. Our chief enjoyment was going to concerts, where he had engagements to sing. I would sit enraptured while listening to his melodious voice. The first song I ever heard him sing was Esther, which means darling in Gaelic. I would imagine him singing it to me. I remember 2 lines that went like this: "The waves are still singing to the shore, while I'm thinking of you, Esther." In this case, Esther is spelled E-S-T-H-O-R-E. One afternoon, while I was sitting in my porch swing, I looked up and saw the most handsomely dressed gentleman walking my way. He wore a tailor-made suit and a derby hat, which was in the fashion of those days. He stopped, tipped his hat, and said, "Good evening, Miss Thompson. I came over to apologize rather belatedly for my rudeness in speaking to you the way I did the morning of your snow battle." It was then I recognized the well-dressed gentleman as Mr. Olds, the old crank, the detestable person about whom I had made such unfavorable remarks. He was now a handsome young knight with a pleasant smile and very pleasing personality, but I could not resist the cutting remark, "Too late to be sorry, no apologies accepted." Apologies were accepted by both of us, for he came up onto the porch and sat down for a friendly visit, which lasted for hours. It was the beginning of a strange courtship, which held never a word of love or affection, but a very real companionship. He called me either sister or old lady from the beginning, which pleased me, for I thought it more interesting than the endearing terms the other young men used. I called him AJ from the first, and so it was AJ and old lady till we were married and the babies came, when he became daddy to all of us. AJ liked to hunt and fish. He would come by my shop after coming off shift on the mine and say, "Come on, old lady, let's take to the hills." I would neglect my work, and we would go for a glorious tramp, either hunting or fishing along the Tulumna River. One day, while fishing, we found an old raft tied up to a stump. Some children had made it and anchored it there. It was a rather crude affair, just 2 big logs with boards nailed on top. We thought it would be fun to row the raft out to the middle of the river where the water was deep so AJ could fly cast from it. It was great fun. AJ finally caught his fish, but in the excitement of reeling it in, he stepped too close to the edge of the raft, dumping both of us into the water. I had learned to swim bare naked as a child, but we never knew what a bathing suit was. This was a different proposition, though. Swimming now in the swift-moving current with all my clothes on was quite a struggle. I was fully dressed in the costume of the gay 90s, high-topped buttoned shoes, black lisle stockings, 2 full ruffled petticoats, and an ankle-length dress. It was topped off with a wide-brimmed sailor hat fastened on with 2 10-inch hat pins stuck from opposite sides of the crown. It would have been an acrobatic feat to remove my hat. I laboriously swam, in all my cumbersome attire, through the fast-flowing stream. Fortunately, I had only a few strokes to swim till I reached shallow water and waded ashore. I think A.J. must have glanced my way and seen I was making it all right, for he kept right on with his fish. Soon he followed me to shore with both fish and raft. After depositing his hard-won fish on the bank, he came over and gave me a rousing smack on my wet back and said, "By George, old lady, you're all right." We went on our hiking and fishing trips almost every evening except Wednesday and Sunday. Those nights were still reserved for Mr. Murphy. A.J. insisted that I keep those dates. I was becoming very fond of A.J. and wished he would say some little word of love or ask me to discontinue seeing Murphy. There was never a word, and when Murphy's name was mentioned, A.J. had only the greatest praise for him. One evening, while A.J. was hurrying me home to keep my Wednesday night a date, I said boldly, "A.J., I have a lot more fun with you than I do with him. I'll quit him if you'd like me to." Much to the deflation of my ego, A.J. replied, "No, old lady, don't you do it. Never give up a good man for a poor one. Murphy is everything a young girl could want. He's a handsome fellow with a wonderful voice and social position. He's foreman of one of the biggest mines around here, and he must have money. Look at me. I'm just a hobo miner. You might call me a 10-day man. I just stay on one job long enough to make a stake, to move on to the next. I want to rove, ramble, to venture, to see what the next turn in the road holds for me. Someday I'll strike it rich, then everything will be different." The last remark expressed the hopes and dreams of every miner I ever knew. They were all an optimistic bunch. No matter what poverty or privation they may endure, some day they're all going to strike it rich. "No, old lady," A.J. repeated. "You grab Murphy if you can. Someday you'll be rich." On the other hand, Mr. Murphy's attitude toward A.J. was so different. Some little bird had told him of A.J.'s calls, and our delightful companionship irked him. He had heard that A.J. gambled all his money, he told me, and he knew one payday never reached the next for him. "How can you tolerate such a bum?" he asked me. "Will you please tell him to take his companionable walks with someone else?" Of course, we quarreled, and I told him not to come see me any more. I was honestly glad of the chance to break our friendship, but when I told A.J. about it, he seemed very sad. He said he was sorry that he had ever come into my life, but we still continued our rambles. I had a sister living on a ranch 5 miles from Stent by wagon road, but it was only 3 miles by the beautiful mountain trail that led us across the Tuolumne River. We had to cross a footbridge, which was suspended by cables fastened to the canyon walls, and it swung high above the turbulent waters. At that spot, the canyon opened into a little valley with a view of a fruit ranch below. There my memory plays tricks on me, for the only memory I have retained of it is with the fruit trees in bloom, surrounding the weather-beaten old house that was literally covered with rambling roses. We would stand together on the swinging bridge, and I would exclaim in awe at the beauty of the scene below. "Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful." A.J. would look down at the same scene and say, "Who in the hell would live there? It's isolated. The only place you can see is up." "What difference does it make if it's in the heart of Egypt?" I would retort, "if it's a home and a beautiful one." I think I was subconsciously longing for a home and wishing that little ranch was mine. I realized then, for the first time, what a difference of opinion we held on almost everything, a difference which carried all through life. But I believed then, and still believe, that if there's enough love, it can surmount any difficulty. A mining camp, where there are so many men and a few women, a girl gets a lot of attention and many proposals of marriage. But A.J. was so different from the rest. I will admit now that from his very first visit I was madly in love with him, and although I called him an old crank to everyone, I felt flattered and flustered whenever he appeared, and turned on all the charm I could muster. But as far as love went, I could never induce him to say one word or make a move in my direction, or even say that he approved of me. Then the roving spirit struck him, and the hills were greener on the other side. He left for Bodie, a mining camp across the Sierra Mountains where miners' wages had reached the fabulous sum of $4 a day. I tried to persuade him to stay in Stent, but to no avail. The morning he left, he came by my shop and bid a friendly goodbye, asking me to write him. "Just Bodie, California," he said in reply to my request for his address. Then he said, "All girls seem to have a weakness for writing, so practice on me." This made me think, well, you old crank, I bet I never do write to you. How I missed him, though. I listened every evening for his decided and individual footsteps on the newly macadamized road that ran to my door. In my mind, I was sure I could hear him coming. And then I would remind myself that if he didn't think enough of me to say one little word of love, then it was a good thing for me that he was gone, and I'd better forget about him. Then I'd add, for my own satisfaction, he was an awful old crank anyway. A week or more had passed when I received a friendly little note from A.J. at his Bodie address. I didn't answer it. I was still hurt to think he hadn't even given me a goodbye kiss. At the same time, I was being entertained by a thriving, handsome young doctor who had a beautiful horse and buggy in which he took me riding every evening. I was having a good time and was determined to forget A.G., whom I firmly believed didn't care a hoot about me. Then I had another note from him saying that he had written to me but had received no reply, and thought surely I had not received his letter. I didn't answer that one either. Thought I, "Old boy, you'll have to declare some interest in me before I ever so much as write a line to you." I was making a good try at forgetting him by accepting the attentions of the young doctor. I wondered then, and so many times since, why I couldn't have fallen in love with the doctor, who made a fuss over me and proposed marriage, and lavished all kinds of attention on me. He had a wonderful career ahead of him. Instead, I had chose a broken-down old miner, 16 years my senior. The only explanation I can give to that is God directs love, and we humans have very little to do with it. A.J. was still on my mind, and though I vowed not to write him, I simply couldn't forget him. Another letter came, by this time much more to my liking. Still, there was no word of love. But why, he wanted to know, hadn't I written? I had given him reason to think, his letter said, that I cared little more for him than I did for the other boys. He had thought I was one girl he could rely on, and that I wasn't just a flirt playing with some poor devil's heart. Thought I won't answer that either. If he really cares for me, he can come back and say so. Imagine my great satisfaction when, about a week later, up on the hurricane deck of the incoming stage, I recognized the dust-covered figure of A.J. Olds. I know that nothing but the eyes of love could have discerned through the crust of red dust and the coming of dark the figure of the man they loved. The doctor was sitting on the porch with me when the stage arrived. I realized that it really was A.J. on top of the stage. There never in all my life was such a moment of ecstasy. I forgot all about the doctor sitting there. I jumped up and, like a happy child, clapped my hands with joy and exclaimed, "Oh, there's A.J. Olds!" I knew instinctively in the moment he'd come back to me and for me. The doctor arose, tipped his hat, and said, "Goodbye, Miss Thompson. I see the lay of the land, and if I ever call on you again, it'll be professionally." Then he was gone. I sat there in the dark, waiting. I waited only a few minutes when I heard the longed-for footsteps come to my gate. I went to meet him and would have thrown my arms around him, dust-covered and dirty as he was, but he would not allow it. He caught me by the arms, and with he on one side of the low fence and I on the other, delivered a tirade of accusations and abuse. If a fellow really cared for a girl, and she gave him every reason to think she cared for him in return, and deliberately led him on, just to have the glory of breaking one more heart, well, I think there should be a special name made for that kind of girl, and you're it, and I'm guilty of being in love with you. Well, I knew you wouldn't care a damn. I just had to come back and tell you about it. So there, I've confessed it. It was a sneaking regard for you that brought me back. Now you'll have another heart to hang on your charm string." Then he put his hand on my face, pressing gently, and said, "Now, old lady, if you're going to marry me, you've got to say so right now, and we'll get married and camp under a tree, for I haven't a damn cent. What do you say?" I had been waiting all this time for the tirade to be over so I could say yes, and now I said it. "Good God, old lady, do you mean it?" and it didn't take him long to jump that low fence. He didn't even stop to open the gate, and then our arms went around each other in one long embrace.